being cannibals than actually are. And you can trace a line right across Africa of going to do with religious communities and how they grow and how they change. What happens to religious communities over time? And I'm going to describe this and exemplify this, and then when we get to the conclusion, I'm going to try to tell you why I think this is so important. That talking about the history, the development, the dynamic that lies within a consideration of the history of a religious community demonstrates for us something very important about religious humanity. I'm going to choose as my first analytic cue, or my clue, to talk about religious communities and the types into which they fall, some terminology that was invented by Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch. And both Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch have their names on the sheet in front of you. If you have those sheets, Weber, I've talked about, the founder of sociology in many ways, and a contemporary and friend of his and another student of the sociology of religion was Ernst Troeltsch. They asked themselves, while they were walking initially in the afternoon together, as they would do after work, the following kinds of questions. How do different religious organizations work? How do they change? Are there predictable ways in which religious communities change? And can we come up with a theoretical way of talking about the predictable ways in which religious communities change? Well, Troeltsch and Weber said, yes, we can. Yes to all those answers, all those questions. Yes, religions change and grow in predictable ways, and yes, there is some terminology that will help us. And the terminology upon which Weber and Troeltsch seized was the terminology of a church as opposed to a sect. They said we can pick two terms that we're going to load with analytical significance. Below each of them, develop some separate categories generated by those terms, and say that religious communities tend to fall into one of those two categories. You can make all kinds of gradients in between, but in the most basic way, religious communities tend to fall into those two categories. Now, before I go down each of those categories, or begin to do that, please don't let the terms church and sect bother you, as they probably do. They look so Christian. Well, they are, because that's where they came from, because Troeltsch and Weber were working in late 19th century Germany, and their vocabulary to talk about religion essentially came from German Lutheranism. But they made the claim, and I think it is one that can be defended, that it's only an accident that these terms come from Christianity. In a way, I wish they'd called them A and B. And I think that's what I'm saying right now, because then you wouldn't be tempted, as I'm always tempted, to say, well, these terms look so Christian, I'm not sure they will work for non-Christian religions. Weber and Troeltsch certainly thought they could, as have others. Well, how do we fill out each of these categories? They said you can put at the top of a piece of paper whatever church in one column and sect in the other, and then generate from that a list of separate characteristics. A list like the following. A church is a kind of natural organization like a family. It's one that seems to one who is born into it as compellingly obvious as a family. You're there and you belong to it because it's the right thing to do and everybody does it. A sect, on the other hand, is an organization that one is not born into but that one must voluntarily join. You leave a natural grouping like a family and go out and seek something else, another kind of religious organization, and that's a sect. Churches, unlike sects, tend to be inclusive and universalistic. They tend to want everybody who lives in a certain neighborhood or a certain country to belong. The more the merrier. Please come in. We'd like to spread our message to you too. Sects, on the other hand, tend to be exclusive and non-universalistic. They tend to say, you can join us if and only if you meet certain criteria. And we don't expect most people to join us. In fact, we see ourselves as a heroic minority. Part of our own self-definition is that, of course, the world doesn't understand us. And of course, the world is not going to all flock to join us because most of the world doesn't understand the truth, as do we, the few people who belong to a sect. Churches, that kind of religious organization, again, sounds Christian, but churches applied to Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sikhism, Confucianism, whatever, membership in them tends to be socially obligatory. If you're born in economic stratum A, in community B, you probably should belong to the Episcopal Church, for example. Okay? If you show up as the hero of a John Cheever short story, you're probably an Episcopalian because you're a white-collar, you work in Manhattan and you live in Connecticut and you do the right things. Okay? And you could think of any other examples where belonging to a certain religious group is socially obligatory. You know, if you live in Lake Wobegon, you got to be either a Lutheran or a Catholic. Membership in a sect, however, is not socially obligatory. Instead, it's dependent upon a particular religious experience. So the question is not, are you the right sort of person? It is, has Christ entered your life? Have you adopted ... And if the answer is yes, I've had that particular kind of experience, then maybe you're eligible for membership in that sect. Now, we could continue this list. I'm not going to quite do that, but I want to give you one other important example of the kinds of characteristics that distinguish these two. Because of all the things that I've said under the left-hand column of the church, that it's socially obligatory, like a family, accommodates itself to the society, is universalistic, churches tend to have a very formalized and institutionalized way of making and talking about church leadership and a way of administering grace. For a church, I'll pick a Christian church, only a certain kind of person can baptize, for example. Only a certain definition of a person can perform marriage ceremonies. Only a full priest can celebrate the Mass. Only a bishop can consecrate someone to be a priest. And I could give other examples from other religions. There's an importance placed upon the correct training and identification of a learned strata of professionals and how they operate. Sects, on the other hand, by their very nature, are anti-administrative, anti-institutional, and anti-identifying church leaders. Now, I'll bet you've all seen this. Have you ever seen a local fundamentalist or evangelical Christian organization? Normally, if you ask who's the minister or who's the priest, the answer is there isn't one. We don't do that kind of thing. We are all. And we don't make the institutional bureaucratic mistake of sending someone to a seminary to become a priest. We believe in the priesthood of all believers, and that's very typical of sectarian behavior, to be against official bureaucratic definitions of people and offices and how grace is administered. Now, one of your reactions to my talking about churches and sects and these two categories of religious organizations, and this is not yours because you're too gracious for this, but if you were less gracious, one of your reactions would be, so what? So you can create a rudimentary taxonomy of religion and put religions into two big categories. I don't see the payoff. The payoff is this. Weber and Trelch and their successors have said the following. You can apply that distinction to the history of the development of religious communities and you'll find something very interesting. And it is that all religious communities start as sects. Of course they do. You would know that by definition, because initially they're voluntary. You're leaving some other religion. Initially they're new and different. Initially there's not time for a bureaucracy to develop. Initially they're voluntary and dependent upon a religious experience, and so on and so on. But over time, all sects develop into churches. Sects begin to accommodate themselves into the world. By the second generation, people are born into sects. Sects pretty soon have... I remember the local evangelical organization in Hanover, New Hampshire, when it was first found, there was no minister. 10 years later, they had an appointed minister. And 30 years on down the line, an organization like that might even have a bishop and a more hierarchical kind of organization. But that's not the end of the story. Sects then... Communities are born as sects and they develop into churches. But watch those churches over time. And what you will see is that there will be people, unless you have a mechanism to prevent this, and that's what we're going to conclude with today, unless you have a mechanism to prevent this, there are going to be people who are going to be dissatisfied with the institutionalized complexity of church life, who are going to break off and form their own sect. Then keep your eye on that sect. 40 years on down the line, it's become a church. And keep your eye on that church. And 150 years on down the line, someone has broken away from it and founded a sect. Elaborate example from the history of early Christianity.